Sweat stained the brim of Wyatt Gable's cap as the shiny new combine rolled past his property line. Debt was burying every farmer in Oakhaven, yet the local dealer openly mocked Wyatt's rusted red tractors. 15 grueling years and 3 market crashes later, only one man still owned his land. In the spring of 2011, the agricultural world was riding a terrifying, unsustainable high. Corn was pushing $7 a bushel, and the smell of easy money had infected the rural plains of Iowa like a fever. Out at Stanton Implement, the largest dealership within a 200-mile radius, the sprawling gravel lot was packed with brand-new $500,000 machines. The air inside the showroom smelled of expensive floor wax, fresh popcorn, and the intoxicating promise of Section 179 tax deductions. Wyatt Gable stood near the parts counter, a stark contrast to the frenzy around him. At 38, Wyatt had the lean, weathered look of a man who worked his own ground. He didn't have farm hands, and he didn't have a trust fund. He had inherited 600 acres of decent but stubborn loam from his father, along with a terrifying pile of lingering debt that had taken him 10 years to aggressively pay down. Now finally free and clear of the bank, Wyatt desperately needed horsepower. His main workhorse, an aging tractor he'd patched together for a decade, had finally thrown a rod through the engine block 2 days prior. Across the showroom floor, Greg Monroe, the slick loan officer from First National, was practically handing out blank checks. He spotted Wyatt and waved him over, holding a glossy brochure for a brand-new GPS-guided climate-controlled rig. "Wyatt, just the man I want to see," Greg boomed, clapping him on the shoulder. "Interest rates are practically nothing. We can get you into a cab with air conditioning and auto steer by tomorrow morning. 5 years balloon payment at the end. You'll double your efficiency." Wyatt looked at the brochure, then at the massive green machine gleaming under the halogen lights. "What's the sticker on that, Greg?" $240,000, Greg said smoothly. "But with corn, where it is, it pays for itself." "Corn won't stay at $7, Wyatt said quietly. "It never does." Rick Stanton, the owner of the dealership, overheard the exchange and strutted over. Rick was a man who wore custom cowboy boots that had never stepped in manure. He thrived on the ego of farmers expertly pitting neighbors against each other to drive up sales. "Wyatt, you're living in the Stone Age," Rick chuckled, adjusting his gold watch. "Dave Corwin just signed for 2 of these. He's expanding. You're shrinking. If you don't leverage your equity now, you're going to get swallowed up. I've got a used rig in the back, only 4,000 hours. I'll let it go for 120 grand. Greg here will write it up in 10 minutes. Wyatt shook his head. "I'm not putting a lien on my land for a tractor, Rick. I came to see if you had any older trade-ins." Rick's smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, patronizing pity. "Older, Wyatt, we ship the junk to the salvage yards in Nebraska. Nobody around here runs junk anymore." Wyatt didn't argue. He turned and walked out the glass doors, ignoring the whispers of the other farmers in the lobby. He walked past the gleaming rows of new machinery all the way to the back of the lot, where the tall grass grew against the chain-link fence. There, sitting in the weeds like discarded iron bones, were 2 ancient International Harvester Farmalls. One was a 1066, its red paint faded to a chalky pink, the tires dry-rotted, and a bird's nest protruding from the rusted exhaust stack. Beside it sat a 1206, missing a side panel and leaking hydraulic fluid onto the dirt. They were brutal, purely mechanical beasts from the 1970s. No computers, no auto steer, no air conditioning, just heavy cast-iron diesel and grease. Wyatt climbed up the rear tire of the 1066 and popped the fuel cap. It smelled stale, but there was no water in the tank. He checked the dipstick black as coal, but no metal shavings. Rick Stanton had followed him out, trailed by Dave Corwin and a few other farmers who wanted to see what Wyatt was doing. Rick let out a sharp, barking laugh that carried across the gravel. "You've got to be kidding me, Wyatt. You're looking at the graveyard." Rick sneered, hands on his hips. "Old man Henderson traded those in last week before he died. I was about to call the scrapper to haul them off. You put a plow behind either of those, the transmissions will grenade before you make it down the first row." The small crowd chuckled. Dave Corwin nudged his buddy. It was the kind of public humiliation designed to pressure a man into debt just to save face. Wyatt climbed down, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What's the scrap value, Rick?" Rick wiped a tear of laughter from his eye. "For both $12,000. But I wouldn't sell them to you. I'd feel bad when your crop rots in the field because you couldn't get it planted." "I'll give you 10,000 cash for the pair," Wyatt said, pulling his checkbook from his chest pocket. "Right now." The laughter stopped. Rick stared at him, his face flushing. "You're serious? You're going to bet your entire 600-acre farm on 40-year-old scrap metal?" "I'm betting it on myself," Wyatt said, writing out the check against the small savings he had carefully hoarded. "Have your boy jump-start them. I'm driving the 1066 home, and I'll bring a trailer back for the 1206. Rick snatched the check, a vicious smirk returning to his face. "Fine. But when these things die in the middle of May, don't come crying to me for a rental. You're committing financial suicide, Gable." 2 hours later, Wyatt was crawling down County Road, 9 at 15 miles per hour. The 1066 sputtered and smoked, every gear whining in protest, the wind howling through the open cabless operator platform. It was a miserable, deafening ride. When he finally pulled into his driveway, his wife Sarah stepped out onto the porch. She wiped her hands on her apron, looking from the smoking, rattling monstrosity to her husband's soot-stained face. She didn't yell. She knew the ledger, and she knew the terrifying math of the modern farm. Wyatt cut the engine. The sudden silence was heavy. "Rick Stanton laughed me out of the yard," Wyatt said, quietly climbing down. "Told everyone I'll be bankrupt by fall." Sarah walked down the steps, placed a hand on the rusted fender of the old Farmall, and looked Wyatt dead in the eye. "Then we better make sure he's wrong. Grab your toolbox. We're losing daylight." Winter in Oakhaven was a brutal, unforgiving season. The wind came howling down from the Dakotas, burying the county roads in white drifts and driving the temperature to 10 below zero, while Dave Corwin and the other heavily leveraged farmers spent their winter inside, attending agricultural seminars and drinking coffee at the local diner. Wyatt Gable lived in his unheated barn. The $10,000 he had spent on the 2 Farmalls was just the beginning. The real cost was paid in blood-frozen knuckles and sheer, exhausting labor. Wyatt set up 2 halogen work lights that cast long, harsh shadows across the concrete floor. He completely tore down the DT-414 engine of the 1066. Every night his breath plumed in the freezing air as he wrestled with rusted bolts that hadn't been turned since the Carter administration. Sarah spent her evenings at the kitchen table, hunting down salvage yards on the family's clunky desktop computer, sourcing a rebuilt injection pump from Nebraska, a new clutch assembly from Ohio, and hydraulic seals from a warehouse in Texas. They spent another $8,000 on parts. It drained their operating capital down to the bone. If the tractors failed, there was no safety net. No bank would lend to them now. Greg Monroe had made sure Wyatt was unofficially blacklisted at First National for his reckless refusal to modernize. By late March, The 1066 roared to life, blowing a thick column of black diesel smoke into the cold barn air before settling into a deep, rhythmic, heavy iron idle. Wyatt leaned against the workbench, his hands stained permanently black with grease, his back aching with a dull, constant pain. But the tractor was mechanically sound. It was a beast reborn. Then came the spring of 2012, and with it the great twist that no computer algorithm or slick dealership salesman had predicted. The rains simply never came. Usually April in Iowa was a muddy, chaotic scramble, but this year the soil turned to dry, powdery ash. The tension in Oak Haven was palpable. Men who had signed notes for $250,000 planters watched the sky with growing, silent terror. The massive, heavy modern tractors that Dave Corwin and others had purchased were suddenly a liability. They weighed tens of thousands of pounds, severely compacting the bone-dry soil, creating hard pans that the struggling corn roots would never penetrate. Wyatt's old Farmalls were significantly lighter. When planting season opened in early May, the 1066 pulled his 12-row planter across the dust-choked fields. Wyatt sat exposed to the elements eating dust for 14 hours a day, a bandana tied over his face. He didn't have auto-steer. His shoulders burned from fighting the wheel, keeping the rows straight by sight and muscle memory alone. Down the road, Dave Corwin sat in his climate-controlled cab, but the stress was eating him alive. Corwin needed a massive yield just to cover the interest payments on his loans. Wyatt only needed enough yield to buy seed for next year and keep the lights on. But old iron demands a toll. On the 4th day of planting, with the critical window rapidly closing, disaster struck. Wyatt was using the 1206 to run the field cultivator ahead of the planter. He was at the far end of the South 40 when a horrific grinding crunch echoed over the roar of the diesel engine. The tractor lurched violently, and the cultivator dropped dead in the dirt. Wyatt killed the engine, his heart dropping into his stomach. He climbed down and looked under the rear housing. The PTO shaft had sheared completely off, twisting the internal splines into jagged shrapnel. The tractor was dead in the water. Without the cultivator preparing the soil, the planter couldn't run. Without the planter, the seed wouldn't get in the ground. As Wyatt knelt in the dirt, staring at the catastrophic failure, a Platinum Edition Ford truck slowed down on the county road. Rick Stanton rolled his window down. He didn't say a word, just stared at the broken-down Farmall, shook his head with a smug, knowing smile, and rolled the window back up, driving away. Wyatt screamed a string of curses into the empty field, kicking the massive rear tire until his steel-toed boot ached. He was beaten. The dealership was closed, and even if it were open, Stanton wouldn't sell him the parts. An hour later, Sarah pulled up in their beat-up farm truck. She took one look at Wyatt's defeated posture and the sheared metal. She didn't offer empty comfort. Instead, she handed him a thermos of black coffee. "I called a salvage yard in Missouri," Sarah said, her voice steady and commanding. "They have an entire rear-end assembly for a 1206. It's sitting in the mud. If we leave right now, drive 6 hours through the night, we can pull the part ourselves at first light and be back here by tomorrow afternoon." Wyatt stared at her. "Sarah, we have to split the tractor in half to replace that shaft. It's a 2-man job. It takes a massive overhead hoist. We don't have the gear out here in the dirt. Then we'll use the front loader on the 1066 to lift it, and I'll be your second man," she said fiercely. "Rick Stanton is not taking our farm. Get in the truck." What followed was a 48-hour waking nightmare. They drove to Missouri, ripped the heavy steel assembly out of a junked tractor in the freezing dawn mud, and hauled it back to Iowa. Out in the open field under the glare of truck headlights, Wyatt and Sarah literally split the 1206 tractor in two. Sarah operated the hydraulics on the 1066, holding thousands of pounds of cast iron, perfectly steady in the air, while Wyatt lay in the dirt, hammering the new shaft into place, his hands bleeding, exhausted to the point of hallucination. By dawn of the third day, the bolts were tightened. Wyatt turned the key. The 1206 fired up, the PTO engaged smoothly, and the cultivator lifted. Sarah, covered in grease and shivering from the morning chill, gave him a thumbs up from the cab of the truck. Wyatt finished planting the next afternoon. Just as he pulled the old red tractor into the barn and killed the engine, the sky bruised purple. A low roll of thunder echoed across the plains. Then the sound of heavy fat raindrops hitting the tin roof of the barn broke the silence. It was the only significant rain Oakhaven would see for a month, and Wyatt's seed was perfectly placed to catch it. July arrived like an open oven door, baking the Iowa plains beneath a merciless, cloudless sky. The historic drought of 2012 was no longer just a headline in agricultural magazines. It was a slow-moving apocalypse strangling Oakhaven. Day after day, the temperature breached 100 degrees. The creeks dried into cracked mud veins, and the relentless sun bleached the landscape into a pale, sickening yellow. Out in the fields, the catastrophic flaw of modern, debt-fueled farming was exposing itself in real time. Dave Corwin and the other heavily leveraged farmers watched in absolute horror as their crops withered and died. Their massive 30,000-pound $250,000 tractors had severely compacted the soil during the previous wet years. Now, with the surface moisture entirely evaporated, the corn roots hit that impenetrable layer of compacted hardpan and curled back on themselves, unable to reach the deeper subsoil moisture. Their stalks turned brittle, rattling in the hot wind like dry bones. Wyatt Gable's fields told an entirely different story. Because he had relied on the lighter, 40-year-old Farmalls, his soil remained aerated and loose. The deep ripping he had done with the 1066 allowed his corn roots to plunge deep into the earth, chasing the moisture left over from that single miraculous May rainstorm. His corn wasn't record-breaking by any means. The stalks were short, and the leaves rolled tight during the heat of the afternoon, but they were green. More importantly, they were actually producing ears of grain. Tension in the county shifted from nervous anxiety to sheer suffocating panic. At First National Bank, Greg Monroe was losing sleep. The slick loan officer, who had mocked Wyatt's frugality, was now drowning in a toxic portfolio. Monroe had authorized millions in equipment and operating loans based on the assumption that corn would remain at $7 a bushel, and yields would be universally high. Now, with the county facing a widespread crop failure, his clients had absolutely no way to make their full payments. Desperation makes men do foolish things. On a blistering Tuesday afternoon, a silver luxury sedan navigated the dusty, rutted path of Wyatt's driveway. Greg Monroe stepped out, wiping a sheet of sweat from his forehead. He looked entirely out of place, his tailored suit hanging loosely on a frame that had clearly lost weight from stress. Wyatt was sitting on the shaded porch, a grease-stained rag in his hand, meticulously cleaning a hydraulic valve from the 1206. He didn't stand up when the banker approached. "Wyatt," Greg forced a tight, artificial smile. "Hot one out there today. I drove past your north quarter. Your corn is holding up remarkably well. Best in the county, frankly." "It'll make enough to cover the diesel and seed," Wyatt replied evenly, not looking up from the steel valve. "What do you want, Greg?" Greg cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Well, Wyatt First National is rolling out a new drought relief equity program. We know things are tight. You own your 600 acres free and clear. We'd love to offer you a line of credit against your land. $500,000 prime interest rate. You could use it to upgrade those vintage machines of yours, or buy out some distressed neighbors when the time comes." Wyatt stopped wiping the valve. He looked at Greg, his eyes hard and unyielding. He saw right through the banker's corporate doublespeak. First National was severely, dangerously over-leveraged, staring down the barrel of massive defaults. Monroe was desperately trying to trap the only solvent farmer in the county into a massive loan just to inject liquid cash back into the bank's failing books. "You want me to mortgage my family's land to bail out your bad math," Wyatt stated bluntly. It wasn't a question. "Now, Wyatt, that's not—" "Get off my property, Greg." Wyatt's voice was dangerously quiet. "You and Rick Stanton spent the last 5 years telling everyone they needed to borrow a fortune to survive. You built a house of cards, and now you want me to be the foundation. The answer is no." Greg's face flushed an angry crimson, but he didn't argue. He turned and marched back to his sedan, the tires spinning in the dry dust as he sped away. 2 days later, the real disaster struck. It was mid-afternoon when the fire siren in town began its long, mournful wail. Wyatt stepped out of the barn and looked west. A massive pillar of thick black smoke was billowing into the sky from the direction of Dave Corwin's property. In these extreme drought conditions, modern machinery possessed a fatal flaw. The new diesel tractors were mandated to run extremely hot exhaust systems to burn off particulate matter, a process called regeneration. Corwin had been out mowing a dry pasture with his massive computer-controlled rig. A single spark from the exhaust had hit the tinder dry grass. With a 20-mile-per-hour wind whipping across the plains, the fire exploded instantly. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He sprinted to the 1206 Farmall. He already had his heavy 20-foot steel offset disc hitched to the back. He fired the loud, clanking diesel engine, threw it into high gear, and roared out of the driveway, completely ignoring the county road speed limits. When he reached Corwin's farm, the scene was absolute chaos. The fire was moving like a freight train, a wall of orange flame devouring the dry pasture and heading straight for Corwin's massive cattle barn and machine shed. Volunteer fire trucks were bogged down in the loose, sandy soil near the road, their hoses unable to reach the leading edge of the inferno. Dave Corwin was standing near his driveway, his face black with soot, screaming in despair. Wyatt didn't stop to talk. He dropped the heavy steel disc blades directly into the earth and drove the 1206 straight toward the advancing wall of fire. The old tractor bellowed thick black smoke pouring from the rusted stack as the engine lugged down under the immense load. Wyatt was tearing up the earth, flipping the dry grass under, and exposing raw, wet dirt to create a fire break. The heat was agonizing. Wyatt had no air-conditioned cab to protect him. The flames roared just 50 feet away, singeing the hair on his arms and threatening to ignite the diesel fumes. His lungs burned, but he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes locked on the fence line. The 1206 screamed the temperature gauge, pinning into the red zone, but the purely mechanical engine refused to die. No computer sensor told it to shut down for safety. It gave Wyatt every ounce of horsepower it had. He ripped a 60-foot-wide trench of bare earth directly across the fire's path, cutting off the fuel supply mere yards from Corwin's barn. The flames hit the turned soil, hissed fiercely, and began to lay down, starved of grass. Wyatt finally pulled the tractor to a halt, the engine ticking and steaming oil seeping from the overheated gaskets. Dave Corwin stumbled over to the old red machine, collapsing to his knees in the dirt, weeping as he looked up at the man and the junk tractor he had mocked just months before. Harvest season brought no joy to Oakhaven. The fall of 2012 was a grim, silent affair. Combines rolled through the fields, kicking up clouds of dust, but the grain tanks took hours to fill. The county-wide yield was a catastrophic disaster. Most farmers pulled less than 40 bushels an acre, barely enough to cover the cost of the diesel fuel required to run the harvesters. Yet the macroeconomics of agriculture played a cruel, ironic trick. Because the drought had decimated the entire Midwestern corn belt, the national supply plummeted. Consequently, the price of corn skyrocketed on the Chicago Board of Trade, hitting an unprecedented $8.50 a bushel. For the heavily indebted farmers, this high price meant nothing. $8 times 0 bushels was still 0. But for Wyatt Gable, the math was staggering. His deep-rooted corn, nurtured by the light footprint of the old Farmalls, yielded a highly respectable 115 bushels to the acre. Under normal circumstances, that was a mediocre harvest. But at $8.50 a bushel, with absolutely 0 debt payments, no massive equipment loans, and virtually no interest sucking away his margins, Wyatt was generating pure, unadulterated profit. He deposited a check for nearly $600,000 into a regional credit union, intentionally bypassing Greg Monroe's First National. It was more cash than his family had seen in 3 generations. The winter winds brought the inevitable collapse. By January 2013, the foreclosure notices were nailed to fence posts all across the county. Dave Corwin, despite having his building saved from the fire, could not survive the financial blaze. His massive loans came due, and with no crop to sell, First National seized everything. The fallout hit Rick Stanton's dealership like a wrecking ball. The gravel lot that had once been packed with eager buyers was now a graveyard of repossessed $500,000 machines. The market was completely flooded. Nobody had the money to buy them, and their depreciation was plummeting daily. Stanton was hemorrhaging money, struggling to pay the floor plan interest on his own unsold inventory. In late February, the largest foreclosure auction in county history was held at the Corwin farm. The mood was funeral-like. Hundreds of farmers stood in the freezing mud, their hands shoved deep into the pockets of their heavy Carhartt coats, their breath pluming in the bitter air. Rick Stanton stood near the front, looking hollow and pale. He was there to artificially bid on the repossessed tractors, desperately trying to keep the auction prices high enough to prevent his own dealership's inventory from being entirely devalued. Greg Monroe stood near the auctioneer's truck, holding a clipboard, looking like an executioner reading a ledger. Wyatt and Sarah parked their beat-up farm truck on the shoulder of the county road and walked into the crowd. They didn't wear designer boots or flashy brand-name jackets. The auctioneer's rapid-fire chant echoed over the loudspeakers, a sharp staccato rhythm that sliced through the cold wind. He started with Corwin's massive GPS-guided green tractors. Stanton placed a bid, trying to set a high floor. But the crowd was silent. Nobody counterbid. The machine that had cost $300,000 2 years prior sold for $80,000. Stanton visibly sagged, realizing his entire dealership was doomed. Then came the land. 300 acres of prime flat Iowa soil. This was what the corporate holding companies and out-of-state investors had been waiting for. The bank had divided it into 2 parcels. "All right, boys, we're moving to the dirt," the auctioneer called out, his breath fogging the microphone. Tract 1. 150 acres directly adjacent to the Gable property. Who'll start me at $5,000 an acre? An investor from Chicago raised his numbered card. $5,000, looking for $5,500, the auctioneer chanted. Wyatt raised his hand. $6,000, the crowd murmured. Heads turned. Everyone knew Wyatt was the guy driving the 40-year-old scrap metal tractors. They thought he was the poorest man in the county. The Chicago investor smirked and raised his card. $6,500. $7,000. Wyatt fired back instantly, his voice calm, ringing clear across the frozen mud. Greg Monroe stared at Wyatt, his jaw tight. He leaned over and whispered to the auctioneer, trying to halt the process, likely to demand proof of funds. The auctioneer paused, looking at Wyatt. Mr. Gable, the bank requires a 20% down payment today, via certified funds. Sarah stepped forward, unzipping her heavy coat. She pulled a certified cashier's check from the regional credit union out of her inner pocket and held it up. We have the cash for the whole parcel. Right here. Let's keep it moving, gentlemen. The Chicago investor, unwilling to tie up that much capital in a bidding war against cash, lowered his card. Sold! The auctioneer slammed his gavel. 7,000 an acre to Wyatt Gable. Silence fell over the crowd. The poorest-looking farmer in Oakhaven had just bought out his neighbor in cash. Rick Stanton stared at the ground, utterly broken. He realized then that he had sold shiny paint, but Wyatt Gable had mastered the actual business of agriculture. Wyatt didn't celebrate. He walked through the parting crowd until he reached Dave Corwin, who was standing by his pickup truck, tears frozen on his weathered cheeks. Dave was a broken man, stripped of his legacy by the very system he had trusted. "Dave," Wyatt said, quietly, extending his heavily calloused hand. Corwin looked at it, ashamed, but eventually took it. "Congratulations, Wyatt. You were right, about all of it." "I didn't buy it for me," Wyatt said, his voice low, so the bankers couldn't hear. "I bought it so the bank wouldn't get it. I own the land now, but I need a man who knows its slopes to run it. I've got 2 old red tractors that need a second operator this spring. You lease it from me at cost. You pay me back over the next 10 years, and the deed goes back in your name." Corwin's eyes widened in absolute shock. He choked back a sob, pulling his cap down over his face, unable to form the words. Wyatt turned and looked at the auctioneer's truck, locking eyes with Greg Monroe and Rick Stanton, one final time. He didn't gloat. He didn't laugh. He just turned his back on them and walked away with his wife. 15 years vanished into the rich, dark soil of Oakhaven, measured not by calendars but by the relentless rhythm of planting and harvest. By the spring of 2026, the agricultural landscape of the Midwest had become a dystopian corporate grid. Massive holding companies had bought up entire counties, operating fleets of autonomous driverless machines that buzzed over the earth like soulless metallic insects. Debt was no longer just a burden for the modern farmer. It was a permanent, inescapable condition of existence. Yet standing like a fortress of defiance in the middle of this digitized valley was the Gable farm. Wyatt Gable was 53 now. The dark hair beneath his cap had surrendered to salt and pepper, and the lines around his eyes were carved deep by sun and wind. But his back was straight, and his ledger was entirely empty of liabilities. He hadn't just survived the brutal shakeouts of the last decade and a half. He had quietly conquered them. His landholdings had grown to over 1,500 acres, all purchased with cash, during the market dips, all owned free and clear. Inside the main shop, a massive heated steel building that had replaced the drafty old wooden barn, the air smelled faintly of fresh oil and hot coffee. Wyatt stood at a heavy steel workbench, meticulously reassembling a fuel injector. A shadow fell across the open bay door. Dave Corwin stepped inside, taking off his battered cap. Dave looked older, his shoulders slightly stooped, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there 15 years ago. He walked up to the workbench and silently placed a thick manila envelope on the scarred steel surface. Wyatt wiped his hands on a blue shop towel. He didn't open the envelope. He already knew what was inside. "That's the final payment, Wyatt," Dave said, his voice thick with emotion. 10 years of lease payments plus the 5-year extension we agreed on to cover the new seed bins, down to the very last penny. Wyatt reached into his heavy canvas jacket, pulled out a folded notarized document, and handed it across the bench. It was the deed to the original Corwin family farm. "It's always been yours, Dave," Wyatt said softly. "I just held on to it so the suits in Chicago couldn't pave it over." Welcome back. Dave took the deed with trembling hands, staring at the embossed county seal. He tried to speak, to offer some grand gesture of gratitude, but the words caught in his throat. He just nodded, wiped a single tear from his weathered cheek, and walked back out into the morning sun, a free man on his own land once again. As Dave's truck rolled down the gravel drive, another vehicle approached from the opposite direction. It wasn't a sleek, Platinum Edition luxury truck. It was a faded, 10-year-old compact sedan with a rattling muffler and a cracked passenger-side windshield. The car sputtered to a halt near the shop doors. A man stepped out, pulling a worn clipboard from the passenger seat. He wore a cheap, off-the-rack polo shirt with the logo of a discount aftermarket parts catalogue stitched onto the breast. It was Rick Stanton. The 15 years had not been kind to the former king of Oak Haven machinery. When the agricultural bubble burst violently in 2014, Stanton Implement had been caught holding millions in depreciating inventory. The corporate manufacturer had ruthlessly pulled his franchise license, leaving Rick personally liable for the massive dealership mortgage. He had lost the business, the custom boots, the luxury house, and his pride. Greg Monroe, the slick banker who had aided in the reckless lending, had been quietly fired and was last heard to be selling insurance in a strip mall 3 states away. Rick walked tentatively into the shop, his eyes scanning the pristine concrete floor and the massive organized tool chests. Then he stopped dead in his tracks. Sitting in the center bay, gleaming under the bright LED overhead lights, were the International Harvester 1066 and the 1206. They were no longer chalky pink and leaking fluid. Over the years, as the farm had prospered, Wyatt had stripped them down to the bare cast iron. They sported fresh mirror-finish red paint, brand new heavy lug tires, and perfectly rebuilt engines. They looked like they had just rolled off the assembly line in Rock Island, Illinois. Wyatt leaned against the workbench, watching his old tormentor take in the sight. "Hello, Rick," Wyatt said evenly. Rick swallowed hard, lowering his clipboard. He looked at the flawless vintage machines, then at the sprawling, debt-free empire Wyatt had built with them. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of a decade and a half of reversed fortunes. "I'm covering the territory for Midwest Ag Supply," Rick muttered, his voice devoid of its former arrogance. "Just checking to see if you needed any bulk filters or replacement belts for the season." "I source my parts direct now, Rick," Wyatt replied. "But I appreciate you making the drive." Rick nodded slowly. He couldn't take his eyes off the 1066, the machine he had called scrap, the machine he had publicly laughed at, had ultimately outlasted his multi-million-dollar empire. "They look beautiful, Wyatt," Rick said quietly, the admission costing him whatever shred of ego he had left. "You were right. I was selling debt, not horsepower. I just didn't see the cliff until we all drove over it." "A lot of people didn't," Wyatt said, offering no pity but no cruelty either. "Drive safe, Rick." Rick turned and walked back to his rattling sedan, the dust kicking up around his worn shoes as he drove away, disappearing down the long, straight county road. Wyatt walked over to the 1066 and ran his hand along the cool, smooth steel of the red fender. Out in the yard, his 22-year-old nephew Liam was firing up the 1206, the purely mechanical diesel engine, barking to life, with a rich, heavy roar that rattled the shop windows. There were no computer screens glowing in the cab, no satellite uplinks waiting for a signal. It was just a young man, a heavy iron clutch, and the open earth. They had beaten the system. They had survived the drought, outlasted the banks, and buried the corporate dealers, all by betting on grit sweat and a pair of old red tractors that simply refused to die. True wealth in agriculture isn't measured by the shiny paint sitting in the driveway. It's measured by the peace of mind that comes from owning your own dirt. Wyatt's journey proves that the hardest path often leads to the strongest foundation. If this story of old iron and unbroken spirit resonated with you, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who respects hard work, and subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories from the heartland.